PlayStation 1 and N64 were at the dawn of 3D platforms, and we saw a lot of them, from Super Mario 64 to Banjo-Kazooie. This was also a time when the old arcade game Pac-Man decided to make its own sub-series, making more out of the Pac family and putting out a game with an actual story to it. What we're diving into today is the surprise remake of that original title. Here is my review of Pac-Man World Re-Pac for the Nintendo Switch. The story here is centered around Pac-Man arriving home only to find his entire family kidnapped by the nefarious robot Talkman, who intends to take Pac-Man's popularity for himself. Pac-Man then goes on a journey to save his family, and really, that's about it. There's not much story here outside of a couple cinematics at the beginning and the end, but it's a simple premise. When it comes to gameplay, Re-Pac is a 3D platformer with very light puzzle elements thrown in. As you trek through each stage, you'll platform around and defeat enemies in order to get to the next one. Now, as a remake, what exactly is different here? Honestly, not much. This is an incredibly faithful remake that adds a couple small mechanics here and there, but keeps the original experience pretty much intact, for better or for worse. As far as the actual differences, many characters got redesigned, along with Miss Pac-Man being relabeled as Pac-Mom, likely from the ongoing debate and lawsuit Bandai Namco is dealing with regarding to the original owners of the Miss Pac-Man name. Some sequences are changed a bit, like the car race being in first person instead of third person, and Pac-Man now has a hover ability to help get across gaps for the platforming, along with an easy mode that amplifies that hover ability. With main progression, this is a stage-based game with a hub area for you to enter stages from. I'd compare it to the hub from the original LEGO Star Wars games, with a room for every world and stages unlocking as you complete earlier ones. You've also got a bit of freedom here, as you'll have multiple worlds available at one time, so you don't have to go in the order of World 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and so on. Now, when you get into a stage, this is a 3D platformer, though it'll often feel more like a side-scroller. There aren't any big sandbox areas for you to free roam. You're on a side path of platforms in side-scrolling fashion, with occasional areas where you can go into 3D and move for depth instead of just left to right. As you check through these areas, you do have a few abilities to help you solve puzzles and fight enemies. You pick up the Pac Dot pellets and fruit like you would in the old arcade game, but dots are ammunition in this one. You can throw them at enemies to kill them, or just ground pound them like Yoshi would. You've also got abilities in the form of dashing and grabbing power pellets to turn into a giant Pac-Man. The latter I really like about this game, because there are certain areas that are kind of like a little mini maze with ghosts that you cannot kill. You gotta hit a nearby switch, grab a power pellet, and turn into a huge invincible Pac-Man head to be able to eat them and clear the area. The fruit, however, is more of a collectible or a key. Every stage has a bunch of locked doors you need to collect a nearby fruit to unlock. Sometimes you have to do this for progression, but most of the time it's just for optional rewards. And that's pretty much the flow of each stage. You side scroll around and platform, you have to hit switches and open up doors with fruit to be able to progress forward all the way until you find the statue of Talkman, blow it up, and can clear the stage. To mix things up a little bit, each world ends with a boss stage, having you use a certain ability or puzzle mechanic to defeat the boss. Not always going up and ground pounding and throwing pellets at the boss, but hitting switches and having them defeat themselves by deflecting projectiles. Now, as I said earlier, this remake is extremely faithful to the original, and it really gives the platforming a clunky and dated feel. The controls are fine, but how the level design is and what you have to do between careful jumping, ground pounding for more height, it all really just feels off and clunky. This goes even further when you get into the wonky camera controls in some boss fights. Thankfully, the game is very simple and easy on difficulty, so the clunk is pretty much the hardest part about the game. Now, overall, this isn't a bad system. It's got a decent amount of collectible stuff, and the clunk is pretty much a product of its own age. I had fun with it, but it does feel like a very basic platformer with what it makes and has you do. Now, when it comes to content and length, like the original, it won't be a super long adventure. Your first trek through the campaign will probably only take you about 5 hours or so, give or take, and someone who's played the game before can probably beat it in around 3 or 4. After that, you can still trek through maze mode for Pac-Man-like challenges and an unlockable version of the original arcade arcade game, but just know it won't be a lengthy trek. Now with presentation, the game looks good. The original game's graphics engine was massively overhauled, and the Switch makes the game look colorful and pretty smooth on renders and models. Very few jaggies around outside of a mirror area that shows a more jaggy Pac-Man when you walk by it, though we do have some performance hiccups. The game tries to keep it steady at 30 FPS on the Switch, and it does pretty well, but drops into the 20s pretty frequently. They aren't huge drops that cause me issues, but pretty noticeable all the same. That's all I've got to say about that, so let's go into battery life. On the original model, Pac-Man World gets a range of 2 hours and 32 up to 2 hours and 53. The Nintendo Switch Lite gets a range of 2 hours and 55 up to 3 hours and 22. The Red Boxer V2 2019 model gets a range of 4 hours and 11 up to 4 hours and 38, and the OLED model gets a range of 4 hours and 26 up to 5 hours and 13. In conclusion, Pac-Man World just came back with an extremely faithful remake, bringing back the charm and clunk of that original game. Now on the downside, the platforming is pretty clunky and dated, it isn't terribly long, and the Switch version does drop frames quite a bit. But if you want to revisit the game in a much better looking way, it's a pretty good remake. Reviews to Go rates Pac-Man World Re-Pac for the Nintendo Switch a 7 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.